Oh, this is the first time I made a video like this, so bear with me. I'm pretty interested recently in this alternative history that we've lost some sort of information since 1811. There's been some pretty cool videos. I recommend you subscribe to Conspiracy R Us. It's a Canadian guy, very clear, very well presented videos, but doesn't make the subject matter any less incredible or believable, even though there's plenty of evidence of it. And it surmounts to the idea that there was a historic mud flood and natural disaster that happened more recently than you might have expected it to, and that a lot of these buildings around uh, America and Europe were really ruins from that civilization. And I've been in places where there've been mud floods in South America, and I've seen actually I was a day and a half out of a volcano, or two or three. I've kind of just ran around uh, escaping volcanoes like Indiana Jones in South America during 2014, 2015, and in Chile and Argentina. And I saw a lot of um, these interesting cities that are all in the middle of nowhere and are beautiful and are supposedly built by Germans. And who's gonna question it, right? I mean, so I didn't. And recently, there's been this idea that in 1811 there was a comet that took out vast amounts of society, and there was an empire supposedly called Tartaria. This is interesting because Tartaria is actually there's a place that was called the Tartars, and there were people called the Tartars and still are in Crimea. It's somewhat confusing whether the Cossacks are the Tartars. It sounds like it's a pejorative depending on whether they're fighting for or against the state. But what it does look like is that the Tartarian civilization, as far as a culture, spread around the world to all over and probably into South America and North America. We have we have sorts of ruins in all of these places, and then when you look for any evidence after 1811, it's just gone. But what you do find a lot of in the 1600s is the Dutch East India Company. And they, if you know much about how Spain controlled Holland, the Habsburg Empire allowed for, just like the Roman Empire supposedly had non Romans recruited to run the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire had the Dutch and the Belgian Huguenots working for their military, as well as Irish and Scottish and anyone else. But at a certain point, I think about 1549, there's an 80-year war where Holland becomes its own independent state. And then from there, the Dutch East India Company starts to expand. And it has a lot of presence all over the world, but one of the places that's interesting because of their sort of singular ability to witness events in history and no one else to see it are um, Krakatoa. And look at that. That's a cool picture right there. Kind of like these giant towers with this Noah's Ark. So Krakatoa happened, and this is a thing about history, who knows when things happen. But allegedly, there's an event according to our calendar at 416, although there's no geological evidence of this eruption. And I get the feeling that this really happened, but we're trying to hide it. Or maybe it happened more recently by 1,000 years, and we need to put a 1 in front of this because of the in the year of our Lord Gregorian thing. There's also a 535 event and a 1680 event. And then things get really crazy around 1883. There's the biggest eruption in history, which is heard around the planet 7 times. Which, I hate to get into the flat earth thing because what are you going to do? But if you're going to go sound around the planet 7 times, I mean, this is the best way. And it also makes a lot of sense when you start to look at the Aryan line across the ring around the North Pole, that there is a culture that is all the way around here that goes, in the same direction and then down. Um, so this guy is a Japanese, Ainu, indigenous. There's plenty of examples of this that I did not know. Japan was full of Caucasians, or at least this guy's not Han, right? Like you can see the difference in the sort of Korean Han-like face, the Chinese looking face that is not indigenous. Here's another example, and it makes another interesting point, or it makes it more relevant. Why are they so interested in these islands near Japan, the Russians and the Japanese back and forth? Here is a Taiwanese indigenous guy, feathers in his hair. This is colorized from before World War II. He's Austronesian. Here's the Etruscan language, which it looks weird, but start right to left and notice it's just the Roman language backwards. Not just back, like mirrored. Pretty weird. So you start seeing that the Roman society and the Chinese society and the Russian society, here's a Native American from America, from California. We found, and we're trying to say that this is, I don't know what they're trying to say anymore, if they're trying to say this is a one-off or if they have some reasons for it now, but I think they've admitted the Scandinavians have come. This guy, Charles Dudley Warner, helped Mark Twain write this book called The Gilded Age. I mainly kept it open to show you this quote: "Everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it." Which is ironic considering some of the conspiracy about this 1811 series of explosions, earthquakes from the Sierra Madrid earthquake, which actually caused the Mississippi River to run backwards for something like 10, 20 days, I think. So there's a number of events that all encircle around. This actually gets me kind of heartbroken because I have an element. This could have been her. And here's Los Angeles. So the thing about Los Angeles is you think, well, it was developed more recently. California was developed recently, right? But actually, it was a series of castles, these Queen Anne's mansions. And here's even a mission that they've undug, where you can see this is not some simple church. This is a temple. This is a very nice Baroque temple, and it shows also the proportions of the doors. They're designed for very large, at least impressive entrances, if not practical entrances for someone taller, if that makes sense. I mean, they always say it's for God to walk into, but is that just metaphor? And also, I hope you've noticed that the golden ratio is a really great clue for when these buildings are not the right height. Because if there's some sort of a piece of evidence that these buildings are buried underground, it's when they don't follow the rules. There's a certain amount of height that needs to be there. When they're just half height like that, that's not right. That's just wrong. So here's also 1860s, 1840s California. You've got in between buildings rebuilt, but you also have some specifically nice structures. And we're supposed to be told that California looked like, beautiful, and then it was built up, but you start to see that these actually look like post-apocalyptic wastelands that were, restored when possible. They have these sort of drawings of, the ideal fortifications, which come off as very Baroque, but then you have these Presbyterian Coptic Russian-looking domes on all the buildings. Here's where it gets kind of interesting to me. You start undigging things like this dam. This dam was in 1946. It's supposed to be constructed, but if you know much about the drought, it doesn't make any sense. Eventually, they piped water in just to fill it, and now it's impossible to know what actually was behind there or what they were digging out. And here's some more examples of houses that are buried, and you can see this in Oxnard, California. Hold on, let me get my power cable. Looks like I need that. About to be. Not working. Great. Okay. So then we get into Ventura, California, and I have a kind of an interest in Ventura because that's where my family's from. This is near the Oxnard town where you'll start to see Nordhof and Ojai. Ojai used to be called Nordhof, which is another interesting point. It's full of these cool, crazy Masonic buildings, and even this guy, the Ojai Taj Mahal, which is called the Pleiades, right? And it was designed by a liberal Catholic priest named Edward Martin, who dedicated it to Krishnamurti. And if you don't know who Krishnamurti is, and you don't want to read Madame Blavatsky, go watch that episode of Young Indiana Jones where he plays soccer with him in India as a kid. Because, yeah, that's pretty gnarly that that's there. And it shows you that there's a very occult connection to Ojai and to the area in general. There's where the Rockets are from in Burbank, right? It's Disney, Burbank, and the Order of the Golden Dawn with Jack Parsons. Here's a Presbyterian church in Ojai. You can see the bell. It's basically buried below a normal level. Here's an abandoned amphitheater, right? That's an amphitheater. People believe that. It's a very military structure, like, right? Then you see these flat new cities around Camarillo. Camarillo is a place that Adolfo Camarillo traded Ojai for about $3,000 worth of gold. Don't ask me how I know that. And in exchange, he got this huge piece of Ventura, which became Camarillo County. It's actually where, and that wasn't until 1964. It was just his farm up until then for his kids' farms for hundreds of years. Or, well, who knows? But in the middle of it, you start to get around Oxnard. You see it has all this great architecture. It has these huge coliseums. It has these, look at that, these windows, this dirt. It doesn't look so bad. Everything's real nice. But the streets, for some reason, it's not that they're, it's not, it's just that the streets aren't done. We've got these concrete brick. It's just the streets. What's up with that? So then you notice it's not that we didn't know how to do stuff. Like, we had this crazy California Pacific Coast Highway. Some people think that the Pacific Coast Highway was done like this, probably not just because it was beautiful, but in order to avoid destroying what was underneath it, because there needed to be a way of quarrying stuff to get out of Hearst Castle. Morro Bay Hearst Castle, I think, is probably the most famous continual museum because it's up on a high hill and it hasn't been destroyed very much of any of that style. So then you can see the Carnegie Art Museum in Oxnard. It is a dedicated donation, in part, I think $12,000 of the 14 of an original $10,000 plan was donated by Carnegie, and then the city finished the building. And it is a, hold on, let's see here, let's go back a second. It is a piece of historic history that they call the neoclassical facade. But once you start finding out about the people who took care of these buildings and built these buildings, it starts to become more obvious that there are less and less architects and more paid offsmen and artists doing the redesigns for Hollywood end up fixing these buildings. So that's an interesting point aside. Then we get to the Camarillo House. The Camarillo House is maybe one of the more famous Queen Anne's mansions. It's a California ranch house that's been converted into a museum. This is the original plan. It is no longer exactly like that. Let's get a little further along. Here is the original house in its design. And if you know anything about the Tunguska holes, go back and watch Conspiracy Theorist's videos. He talks about these thin, less than 20 to 30 feet ovals. Now, you'll notice that this is more ovular, and it's become they've cut it, turned a road into it, and they built a circle, but it was an oval. And The property itself is on a. Let me see if I can do the 2D. It'll make it easier to see. It's on a star fort. I'm pretty sure because if you look straight down, you can't see it at this point so easily. But if you get the historical picture, you can tell a lot of this stuff is kind of covered. But the original plan of the house, you've got these two major points, and then the third and fifth point actually in the center. There's an entire tower that the house is built around. So these all points were the original walls of some sort of a structure. And then they were somehow fixed by this guy and uh, his associate, um, Herman Aunlauf and Franklin P. Ward. And I'd like to find more about these guys. I've been looking for an obituary or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and just make it up, and you tell me if you find out if it's true or not, that these guys are Hollywood guys, because the thing that's interesting about Camarillo is it's where Technicolor comes from, it's right above Hollywood, it's where everybody's making their movies, and they have to constantly make sets, tear down sets, and make these westerns, make these Hollywood renditions of Egyptian films and Greek films, and the Addams Family comes out on TV and stuff like that. So they have this series of houses that these guys are known for, which are not very many, are kind of identical. They look very similar. Here's the more well preserved one, because the thing about the Camarillo House, it was lived in really up until the 90s, but this in 1991 was converted into a museum, and you can see underneath the house what is going on here. There's clearly a change, and there's windows, which is interesting because there are not in the Camarillo House, but it also has the same barn structure to the side of it, and you can get some pretty cool looks at the property back in the day, as we like to call it in California. And look at that, there's an underground room with a window. I mean, come on. Like, what is that supposed to be? It's a dome that's underground. I mean, at first I thought that was a stove, but I looked a little bit closer. Here's where the fireplace has that same, you've got a peacock. Here's something also that conspiracy guy has been making these videos talking about the heater that works through a sort of Tesla coil rod that the tower is built in and grounded into the house, which I think Benjamin Franklin, free public domain, the Benjamin Franklin lightning rods into the house as a grounding system. So if this is designed to actually where that grounds off, and then it would heat up these coils, and then the energy would be trapped in some sort of metal, and sort of very hot metal. That's interesting to me that it has a peacock as the art, because the other idea of this sort of steampunk society is that these things have a practical purpose, and what better than the peacock to represent that society. Notice the perfect wood carving. And I'm not saying this isn't, I mean, the thing about California is so many artists came to make movies, so of course it's going to look like whatever fantasy it's supposed to. But you'll start to find, like, these guys here at the roof here, they didn't know exactly how to remake them, so they went to Hollywood, and Hollywood was making silicone moldings of them, and then they duplicate them to repair the house. So these guys are held together by Hollywood, and it makes me wonder if that's not a big part of why some of these people are so famous for their architectural work when they haven't really done more than one or two things outside of Hollywood. Here's the basement for that house, right? Like, it just seems okay. And then you can look at some of these Queen Anne style houses, if they're painted right and look nice, and another thing, Queen Anne's mansions comes from Petty France, Westminster, London, and you can't find any photos of them because they were pretty well destroyed. Yeah, but there's this, and there's something in Cincinnati or in Arizona or something. I mean, I've seen so many of these triangular buildings with the tower on the front, whether they've collapsed the top because they couldn't keep it built properly, but you still got these power centers at the top. So that pretty well covers my first video. I mean, I want to show off a couple more things with San Juan Capistrano. Really recommend going there because this place is one of the more intense missions that's not completely fallen apart. But yeah, I wanna leave that on that and just focus on that. Like, there's something interesting about California I want to remember to say. So there was a church called the Mary Magdalene Chapel, right? Who's going to name a church after Mary Magdalene in this period in time before the Da Vinci Code comes out? This is like 1899, you know? So there was a problem with the roof. The bell collapsed. It was brought to the Camarillo House because no one seemed to want it, and now it's been turned into this sort of black bell gazebo for marriages, which is, I mean, I I wanna. That sounds cool. So thanks a lot for watching that, and I hope that this was helpful. Please make some videos, people.